So in the last lesson, we went through and solved using the square root method. So for example, this x squared minus 25 equals 0. Right, we got the x squared by itself. So we added the 25 over. X squared equals 25. We took the square root of both sides. And we always put that plus or minus. So this ended up being x equals plus or minus 5. That's a pretty quick, easy way to solve a quadratic. Now, the problem with that is it doesn't always work. So look at this problem. X squared minus 8x plus 15. And I could minus a 15 over. The problem I have here is I've got two x's. I've seen this before. I've seen kids try to add the 15 over. So x squared equals negative 15 plus 8x. And then take the square root of both sides. Well, the problem with that is if I want to find what x is equal to, right, I have to plug x in over here. That doesn't make any sense, right? You can't have, if you're trying to solve for x, you can't have an x in your answer. So when you have a middle term, or we call this the linear term, that 8x term right there, you cannot solve it using that square root method like we have in the past. So we have to have other ways of solving it. And we're going to go through one of those ways today. Just as a quick side note, if you'll add these to your notes here. This was not in there on the original notes. We want to have the equation, the quadratic, in something called standard form. So if you put the quadratic in standard form, and what that means is this first term, we call that the quadratic term, comes first, the squared term. This term, the first power, the x term, is the linear term. It comes second. And then the constant comes third, equals 0. This is called standard form. So if you want to pause that for a second, write down standard form. When we go to solve this other way, we want to have the equation in standard form. If the equation's in standard form and there's no linear term, if this one is missing, right, up here you see how it has a quadratic term and the constant term. The middle term, the x term, is missing. Then you can use the square root method. But if it has that middle term, like this one, then that square root method doesn't work anymore, and we have to have other ways to solve it. And there are some different ways we can do it. This is one of them, which is by factoring. That's what we're going to cover today. Solving by factoring is based off a really simple principle. If I have a times b equals 0, just think about it for a second. What does that tell me about a or b? Well, if a times b is equal to 0, either a has to equal 0 or b has to equal 0. One of those two things has to be true. So if I gave you an equation and I said x plus 5 times x plus 2 equals 0, well, the only way that can happen is if either x plus 5 equals 0 or x plus 2 equals 0. So either x plus 5 has to equal 0. So if I solve those two equations, they'll give me my two answers. So if I minus the 5 over, x equals negative 5. If I minus the 2 over, then there's my two answers right there. This is like our method. This is the way we're going to try to solve these equations. So if I look at this equation, here's our steps. The first step is to make sure that it's in standard form. So put the equation in standard form, which is the ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. It's really important. It has to equal 0 for this method to work. The second step is I want to write it in its factored form. So let's do that. We know how to factor, right? This is a quadratic trinomial, so we know we do our two sets of parentheses. That times that has to give me x squared, so it's got to be an x and an x. That times that has to give me 8, a positive 8. So it could be 1 and 8, 2 and 4. I want the combination that adds up to be 9. That's the 1 and the 8. So I'm going to go plus 1, plus 8. Okay, so now that was step number 2. I got it in its factored form. Step number 3 is to set each factor equal to 0. So set each factor equal to 0 and solve. So let's do that here. I take the x plus 1 set it equal to 0. So I just, and now an x plus 8, set it equal to 0. So in this one, I just minus the 1 over. There's one of my answers. X equals -1 minus the 8 over. Yeah, there's my two solutions. X equals -1, x equals -8. So if we're trying to solve, and by the way, I could not use the square root method because it had that middle term. If it's got the middle term, you can't do it. So if it does have the middle term, we're not going to use the square root method. We're going to try a factor. We put the equation in that standard form. We factor it, right? We factor it, get my two factors, set those factors equal to 0 down there, and solve it. I'm going to skip past that one. Let's try this one right here. So I have x squared minus 8x plus 15 equals 0. Okay, so make sure it's in standard form. This one is, I've got the x squared, the x, the constant equals 0. Second step is to factor it. So do my two sets of parentheses. What times what gives me x squared? What times what gives me 15? When you go to do this one, be careful. To get a positive 15, it could be two positives or two negatives. The numbers have to add up to be a -8, so it's got to be two negatives. So -1 and -15, -3 and -5. I think that's it. We want the ones that have to be -8. It's those two right there. So if this top part, right, it factors to be x minus 3 and x minus 5. Okay, take your two factors and set them equal to 0. X minus 3 equals 0. X minus 5 equals 0. So add the 3 over. Add the 5 over. And there's my two answers. I get a positive 3 and a positive 5. Sometimes, I'm going to skip past that one. Sometimes equations are not in standard form. So if you look at this one does not look like standard form. Remember, standard form looks like this. The x squared term comes first, x term second, constant third. So, and I want it equal to 0. So I'm going to take this 12n, minus 12n, I'm going to move it over to that side over there. When I do that, it changes sign. So I have n squared. When I move the 12n over, put it in the middle, it'd be a plus 12n, because I moved it to the other side, and I have a plus 36. Okay, now it's just a matter of factoring that. So the second step is to factor it, two sets of parentheses, n and n. I want to take the factors of 36, a positive, that add up to be a positive 12. So I want two positives, 1 and 36, 2 and 18, 3 and 12, 4 and 9, 6 and 6. Okay. I want the ones that have to be 12. That's the 6 and the 6. Okay, now take my two factors, set them equal to 0. So I take each one separate. N plus 6 equals 0. Hey, these two are going to have the same answer, aren't they? Minus the 6 over. If I solve this one, I'll get the same answer as I got when I solved that one. So this time, I only have one solution. Really, it's one solution that's repeated twice. It could be -6 or -6. Okay, all the ones we've done so far have been pretty easy to factor. Sometimes they won't be. Let's try this one right here. Okay, first of all, this one's not in standard form. So I need to move the, by the way, just side note, it's always easier to factor if your squared term, your quadratic term is positive. So that was already positive. So instead of moving the 3k squared, if I move the 3k squared over to there, it would become a negative. That makes the problem harder. So I'm going to leave the 3k squared over here. Let me slide that over a little bit, sorry. I'm going to move the 3k squared over to here. And then I'm going to move the other two over. So I'm going to add the 5k over to this side. It becomes a positive because I moved it over there. I'm going to move the 8 over. So it becomes a minus. Okay, this one is a little harder to factor because of the 3 out in front. So remember, if you do have a number out in front, this is a good review. I times the 3 and the -8 together. That would be -24. And then I look for the factors of -24, that up to be 5. So I could do -1 and 24, -2 and 12, -3 and 8. Those two right there, -3 plus 8 adds up to be 5. That's the one I'm looking for. And then I have to do that grouping. So I go 3k squared. I replace the 5k with those two. So minus 3k plus 8k minus 8. I'm going to forget about the equal sign for just a second. I'm just going to factor this. So I put the first two in parentheses and the last two. Take out your common factor, so it'd be 3k on that first one. On that second one, take out an 8. Now they both have a k minus 1. Factor out a k minus 1. That would leave me with a 3k plus 8. So you got to remember those good factoring skills. Sometimes, if there's a number out in front, it's a little harder to factor. Okay, set each of those equal to 0. So I'm going to go k minus 1 equals 0. 3k plus 8 equals 0. And I've got to solve both of those. So this one I'd add the 1 over. So k equals 1. This one I have to minus the 8 over. So I get 3k equals negative 8 divided by 3. So my other answer comes out to be, I get 1 and a negative 8/3 are my two solutions. So again, these problems aren't too tough other than the factoring. Like the factoring is the most time-consuming, hardest part. Hey, let's do one more. I want to do one more of the factoring ones that are a little more challenging. So again, look at this one. I've got a 2x squared, 35. So I want the 2x squared to be positive. So I'm going to move these other two over. So I'm going to move that 9x over. So it'd be 2x squared plus 9x. I'm going to move that 35 over. So it'd be a minus 35. Okay, now I'm going to factor it. It's got that 2 in front, so I got to do the longer method, right? 2 times negative 35 is negative 70. Find your factors. Negative 1 and 70. Negative 2 and 35. Negative 3 doesn't go into it. 4 doesn't. 5 does. 5 and 14, I believe. Okay, those two, negative 5 plus 14 adds up to be 9. So those are my two factors. So I'm going to rewrite it 2x squared minus 5x plus 14x minus 35 equals 0. Okay, look for your common factor, first two and the last two. So I could take out an x out of those first ones. The second one, I could take out a 7. We want to make sure those are the same, which they are. So take out the 2x minus 5. That leaves me with an x plus 7. Okay, that's the hard part. That's the factoring part. The last step is take each of those and set them equal to 0. So I'm going to go 2x minus 5 equals 0 and solve that. X plus 7 equals 0 and solve that. So I have to add the 5 over. 2x equals 5. Divide by 2. So 5 halves is one of my answer. Minus the 7 over. There's my other answer right there. So 5 halves and negative 7 are my two solutions. So we're just following those steps. Step number 1, put it in standard form. Step number 2, you got to factor it. Step number 3 is you take those factors, you set them equal to 0, and you solve those two equations. And they're usually really easy to solve. Really the hardest part on these is the factoring. Like that's the part that will be the challenging part. It's good that we're all really good at factoring because that'll make it easy. All right, thanks guys.